Hey, everybody. Welcome to this midweek devotional space that is made possible by the people of University United Methodist Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Whether you're connecting with us weekly through the emails that we send out, or maybe you've just stumbled upon us online and you're wanting to see what this is all about, we are coming to you on a weekly basis, trying to offer some inspiration, maybe some deeper reflection that might be food for thought and maybe a feeding of your spirit in some way each Wednesday. So I hope if it's your first time, you'll join us again. If we don't know each other, my name is Reverend Katie. I'm the senior pastor of our congregation. And it's pretty early in the morning right now. So I'm sipping on my coffee, which is pretty important, especially for this time. It's about 4:15, and I'm not proud of having to get up sometimes this early, but there are just some moments where a mom of three, this is the only chance I'm gonna get to be productive or to have a quiet moment, and even that is not guaranteed. But I've been thinking this morning, it's Tuesday morning, the day after Martin Luther King celebration over the course of the United States. And it is the eve of the inauguration of a new presidential administration. And so it's a really, I think, a meaningful time, kind of a gap moment, a bridge between two major parts of our history, a past that we continue to try to bring into the present, and a dream not yet realized by any stretch of the imagination that we're hoping to pull into our future. And it is our leaders that we're continuing to pray for and wish well in this next season, that we just really, I hope all of us are continuing to pray for soon to be President Biden and Vice President Harris. No matter what our beliefs are, our stripes are, every leader that comes into that seat, we know the crucible of leadership and the weight of that responsibility is very difficult. And so I have been thinking about leadership today. And if you know me at all, one of the things that is a foundational belief, well, really two, a foundational belief is that leadership comes at any age and from any seat. So no matter whether you have a position in the highest halls of power or you're one of the youngest ones among us, I believe that each of us has a responsibility to tend and to share our own agency for the goodwill, not just of ourselves, but in fact, more for others. And so I've been thinking about the struggle of leadership lately, because I've been living that as a pastor, but I know that we all lead in various ways in our families, in our workplaces, in organizations that we lead in the community, and in our relationships, in our marriages. And it is both a gift and, man, a major gravity that we have to continue to tend with. Sometimes it certainly feels like a burden. But I want to share with you a story, again, in this gap time between what's coming and the story that we have remembered just hours before. I want to tell you about part of Dr. King's story that I had heard a long time ago, but had really forgotten. I've read a lot of his speeches, some of his books and letters. And this particular part of his story, when he was on the National Mall giving the I Have a Dream speech, is so powerful because it shows the internal battle that we continue to have to tend as leaders, no matter in what space we are leading. And so this story comes from one of King's advisors, Clarence Jones, and he reminds us that when King was preparing for this speech, he had a couple metaphors that he was playing with. And I know this well. Whenever you've got about 5 minutes, as Jones said, that King was given to give this important speech of a lifetime among hundreds of thousands of people and a crowd of folks, millions that were watching on TV, he had to ask himself, all right, how can I focus? So he had this metaphor of, I have a dream, or he had, I think, a metaphor of like writing a blank check for society, a very kind of more somber, practical way to come And of course, there were so many influences that were driving his words. He was still trying to speak to the base of those that were hoping for change. And of course, he was trying to speak to a crowd of white men and women across our country that needed to see the picture of what was possible differently. And the temptation to placate to those was strong in that time. And so he chose a different metaphor, and he wrote that speech and was starting to give it from the podium. And Jones talks about the fact that King, in a moment, had kind of a stumble, or he was really kind of off his game. And it was at that point that Mahalia Jackson, someone that at least a few of us may know well because her soulful sounds of music have been marinated in our culture here in Louisiana. Mahalia Jackson was on the not a chancel, but I guess the stage, if you will, only about 50 feet away. And she just started to call out from her own spirit, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." Giving him an invitation, if not a challenge, to share truly from his authentic self, from his wholehearted belief of what he hoped, from the truth of what he knew God was calling him to lead folks into. It was the words that he had on the cutting board, saying that it was too much for folks. But in that moment, Jones says that King just took his speech and slipped it to the left side and began to give those words that are so famous and ones that we continue to point to today as a challenge for what we have not reached together as a people, black, white, otherwise. That vision is still operative in our minds, but needs to continue to grow in our hearts and in our systems. But those words are still very much alive today. What would have happened if he hadn't listened to Miss Jackson and her spiritual wisdom for the moment? That call to wake up, if you will, and to remember who he was, and to allow what God had placed internally as a seed of wisdom and truth, and to allow that to emerge and unfold among that gathered community. That story reminds me that so much of leadership is self-leadership. It's not as much about what you do outside of the decisions you make or the speeches that you give. It is first what happens in the human heart. Everyone these days seems like they have an opinion on what leadership is and isn't. Whether you look at the commentaries about past presidents or current president and then the one coming, Lord knows everybody has expectations that either have not been fulfilled or they hope will be by the person taking the seat. Is leading being a prophet or a change maker? Is leading being a stabilizer or a manager or someone that reaches back to allow the group, whoever we are, to go back into the past that were better days? Don't say anything to rock the boat because the unknown is too hard to hold, right? I know that I have lived that crucible of leadership as a pastor, and I'm sure it's not unfamiliar to each of you that are hearing my words, and probably you're thinking about situations that have come up, or perhaps the comments or unsolicited advice that you have received over time that have either been invitations of challenge that were welcome or ones that made you doubt yourself or worry about the future. I've found, maybe this hasn't been your journey, but I have found when I have been preoccupied or obsessed with the externals, whether they be financial stability of the church that I'm leading, or the stakeholders around me being pleased, or my supervisor trying to make sure that they are happy with the work I'm doing, or the metrics in the book of how many people are coming to whatever I'm leading, that those metrics are continuing to grow. You know, when I allow those things to be that which drives me, I'm often putting myself in a prison internally of my own making. And perhaps if not oftentimes, it leads me very quickly to be tempted to miss the mark and to lean into the sin of a myriad of consumeristic tendencies. Maybe that looks different for you, but I think we all have those Achilles heels, those places where leadership becomes less than it could be in us. There's some part of us that knows that when we are in that internal prison, when we are not coming to our leadership, telling the truth, and coming to our leadership of other people in a wholehearted way, kind of putting on a mask and holding ourselves back because people just can't take it, or it doesn't feel like it's the right time. Again, some of those reflections are responsible, but often, if not always, especially in this divisive environment where it seems like no matter what choice we make, it's never the right one to some folks. It is a prison where we don't honor God with our words, and often our witness with our lives becomes certainly less than God desires for us. And so lately, I have been focusing on the words of Paul in the second letter of the letters to Corinth that he made. You know, we focus a lot on 1 Corinthians with the love chapter and so many of the other words that come, but 2 Corinthians is so profound, especially in chapters 4 and 5. And I just want to share some of these parts of those scriptures with you. I won't read the whole blocks of text, but I want you to remember these verses and go back to them as maybe words of hope and challenge for you. First, I kind of want to go backwards, starting with chapter 5, verses 7 through 15, as Paul speaks into the crucible of leadership, as he knows his own folks are dealing with this tension between kind of humanity, fleshliness, the body, and then the spirit, which in their culture and time always seemed fully divided and separate, and it should never be integrated. But he's calling, while we have the temporary edifice of and shelter of the tents of our human bodies, of our fleshly living, even though we wish that we could be with God in heaven, while we're still here, we might as well make good with the time that we have. And so he's speaking into that tension and inviting them to see their work as Christians differently in the world. From chapter 5, verses 7 through 15, selected verses. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each of us may receive what is due us for the things done while in the body, good or bad. What we are is plain to God, and I hope it is also plain to your conscience. If we are out of our mind, as some say, it is for God. But if we are in our right mind, it is for you. And he died for all, that those who would live would no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. So again, all I hear Paul saying is, with his leadership that was often found to be characterized by reckless candor. He was pretty pointed in his words often, and we even find some of his words jarring and kind of unfamiliar today. But he says we're always on the judgment seat, and he basically says God knows everything about you. God knows what truth you know internally, and knows when you're kind of bluffing outside just to placate people, or to basically save your hide, or to make sure that the boat isn't rocked and stability for you or your family is ensured. But it's plain to God that you're called to something more. And so Paul is saying in this time to reconcile to God, to reconcile you to yourself, so you can wake up in the morning and actually live with yourself. When people say that you're out of your mind, that should be something perhaps that could be celebrated, because at least you know that you're living for God and not for external expectations or circumstances. That's my Cliff Notes version of what Paul is saying. And it's a source of kind of uncomfortable challenge, but also, I guess, an exciting invitation as well. So in the second letter, chapter 4, verses 7 through 11, hear these words. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We may be afflicted in every way, but not crushed, persecuted and perplexed, but not driven to despair, not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. All I hear Paul saying here is that, Jesus allowed himself to be sacrificed, not only in body, but to sacrifice his seeming reputation, sacrifice people's acceptance of his, worldly standing, and allowed himself to have a downward pull for what God was calling him to do in the big picture. And if we can allow that death, that downward pull, to be operative in us internally, to be accepting of the call to sacrifice some of our own comfort for the will of others and for what God dreams for our lives, for our ministry, for our Christian witness outside of the church, in whatever halls of the world that you lead, then that is where real freedom is. I wonder what Paul's words call out in you today, what situation in your life that might feel like a crucible of leadership that it might speak into this morning. I am praying for myself, as I am for you, that we all would be set free, first by our own self-leadership from the bondage of sin and internal death, that we would not live our lives sleepwalking or treading water, but that there would be moments where we know the times and the spaces and the purposes that we were meant for, and to lean into those, sometimes with even reckless abandon. Paul was not theologizing in an abstract way. He was talking practically about how we can live faithfully day after day after day. And so I pray for you, dear leader. I pray for our leaders that are being installed in our nation's seats and in every hall of power, in every state, in every community. And as we all are able to make a new beginning every time we wake up, I want to share this poem that is a prayer for you and for me from John O'Donohue, this work to bless the space between us. And it is from the poem For a New Beginning. In out-of-the-way places of the heart, where your thoughts never think to wander, this beginning has been quietly forming, waiting until you are ready to emerge. For a long time, it has watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside you, noticing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play in the seduction of safety and the gray promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, wondered what you would allow, and if you would always live like this. Then the delight, when your courage kindled and out you stepped onto new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream. A path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning that is at one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure. Hold nothing back. Learn to find ease in risk. Soon, you will be at home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses what the world awaits in you. May it be so for you and for me.